Levi Brackman here with Truth, Jewish Wisdom for today. Thank you so much for joining once again. Today, I have a real treat. I have an interview with JJ Kimche. JJ is a PhD candidate at Harvard University. He studies modern Jewish philosophy. He is an expert in the history of the Kabbalah and is an incredibly articulate scholar and a wonderful teacher. And I had him on last season, and I read some of his articles about the Kabbalah. I listened to other podcasts where he explained about the Kabbalah, and I thought I needed to have him on again to have a conversation about the origins of the Zohar, the origins of the Kabbalah, and the impact the Kabbalah and the Zohar has had on Judaism up until this day. The interview and the conversation went on for about an hour and a half, and so this is a long episode, but I think you will get a huge amount out of it. I'm really excited that I'm able to present this conversation to you today. And with no further ado, I present to you my conversation with JJ Kimche about the Zohar, the origins of the Zohar, the Kabbalah, and the impact the Zohar has had on Judaism till this day. And also perhaps how one might be able to extricate the Kabbalah from Judaism and see what a Judaism without the Zohar might look like. Here's the conversation. Thank you so much for being here again. You're going to be the only guest this season. I really appreciate you being here, being open to this conversation. Now, one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on talking about the Kabbalah, because that's what this season of the podcast is all about, is because I'm into the Kabbalah, I get a lot of these clips now on my YouTube feed about the Kabbalah. And I have these people who show up and they say, what is the Kabbalah? And they're answering what the Kabbalah. And their answer is, it was given to Moses at Sinai, and it was part of the oral law, the Sheba'al Peh, and that was given to the Jews at Sinai, and it's always been there forever. And it just was revealed now, and now we have it. And how lucky we are that we have this revelation that people previously did not have. Now, I know that you're not going to give me that canned response, and I know that listeners to this podcast would not be interested in that kind of response. So I know you're going to give us a much more nuanced, thought-out, scholarly idea of where Kabbalah is, where it comes from, and specifically also the Zohar.
Sure, let's go down that journey a little bit regarding Kabbalah. A few preliminary points ought to be pointed out before we can proceed. Number one is, importantly, is the distinction between Kabbalah and mysticism more generally, Jewish mysticism more generally. Mm-hmm. Generally, in the scholarship as it's seen today, Kabbalah is treated as a very specific strain of ideas, a cosmos of symbols, of motifs, and of texts, and of central ideas that cropped up roughly about 12th, 13th century, and we're going to talk about that. However, Jewish mysticism is something that does seem to be significantly older. We have chapters in the Bible, for instance, which appear to be mystical in import, in other words, saying things that aren't supposed to be understood at face value, or rather impossible to understand at face value. It clearly contains some sort of esoteric or recondite message within it. You have chapters in the rabbinic writings, famous stories about four rabbis who entered the orchard, etc., etc. And you have elements there. You have a whole series of literature in the early medieval period called the Hechalot literature and Merkava literature, and all of these are heavily mystical texts of various sorts. However, these aren't necessarily to be identified with Kabbalah, even though Kabbalah, as we'll discuss, draws quite heavily from them retrospectively. And this is actually an argument among Kabbalistic scholars today. So just the first thing to have in mind is that many of those YouTube videos, and by the way, I think you have the YouTube algorithm is not serving you very well. You have the wrong list of videos on your YouTube watching list, as probably do I. However, many of those in that particular list would probably no doubt point to one coherent tradition of Jewish, or literally Kabbalah, literally Masorah tradition of Jewish mysticism from the ancient period to the modern day. And the point is that such an identification should be resisted, or at least seriously questioned from the outset. In other words, to what extent are we dealing with one coherent phenomenon? What extent are we actually dealing with a system that develops and evolves very considerably from one century to another? The second thing that I want to say before even starting to discuss any of this is a very important point, is the application of history to something like mysticism or something like a secret tradition is something quite difficult and quite tricky for the following reason. Historians can deal with what is. Okay, and are very good at dealing with what is, and consider all the evidence of things that is. When it comes to an intellectual tradition like this, the texts essentially are what's important. So medieval manuscripts, books, letters, whatever, you have ideas that seem to be there. The problem with the mystical tradition is that part of the ethos of a mystical tradition is not to write anything down.
Yeah.
Is not to let on, is not to even let others know that you have the secret in the first place. And so historians and Kabbalists playing a little bit of a different game. And this is why there's actually quite a difficult discussion to have between the academy and those of the Beit Midrash, or those of the more traditionalist bent, because the historian will say something like, oh, there's no evidence of X. Right.
Yeah.
And among historians, that's it. That's sof pasuk. That's the end of the sentence. Right. There's no evidence for X, and therefore there's no reason to suppose that it exists. And the truth is that when it comes to studying other parts of Jewish intellectual history, such as halakha or such as Jewish philosophy, the historian and those practitioners have a lot to talk about. So if I'm talking with a halachist, for instance, and I say, okay, let's open up the halachic text. Let's see what the Rosh writes and the Torah and the Rambam and this and that, and you can follow a very specific chain of causation, of intellectual causation, essentially. However, when it comes to tradition, historians and members or practitioners of the tradition are playing a different game, right? So I would say to the Kabbalist, there's no evidence that such and such an idea exists. And the Kabbalist may turn around to me and say, of course there's no evidence. That's the whole point. We don't want there to be evidence. The whole point of the mystical tradition was that they left no evidence behind whatsoever. And of course, the historian has little to say to that, because as soon as you admit, or as soon as you state that lack of evidence is an essential part of the secretive oral tradition that's not supposed to be whispered at all ever to anyone who's not part of a very small circle of initiates, as soon as you say that, so that causes a lot of tension with the essential historical enterprise, which is the whole point of which is to sniff out evidence. Okay, that's the sort of thing that we must say before even beginning to discuss the history of Kabbalah, which is that it is uniquely an area of inquiry which is somewhat resistant to the basic tenets of trying to create and craft a history.
So, which is why some people could argue that there was a certain point where the scholars and the powers that be decided that because there were other forces, which were now, let's call them rationalist forces, which were trying to downplay this whole idea of a system in the Godhead. Therefore, we need to now write it. A//M.
That is generally the line taken by many traditionalists. And the truth is that they're facing a difficult issue. The difficult issue is that there suddenly appears to be, for almost no reason, or for no discernible reason, an explosion of Kabbalistic writing and text produced by Kabbalists in the mid to late 12th century, going into the 13th century, right? So the late 1100s and then into the 1200s. And suddenly you have this profusion of texts. Now, a scholar from the academy will look at this and say, this is the invention, or this is the introduction of Kabbalistic ideas. This is when Jewish mysticism, that is generally called Kabbalah, begins. And others will, and of course the Kabbalists will say, no, it's part of a much, much older tradition. And again, it's not so easy to adjudicate between the two. However, we can study very specific texts and see, do they bear the hallmarks of the time in which they're written, or the time, a much older time, which they are supposed to have been written in, or supposed to, or the idea is supposed to have been formulated.
The ideas were, Kabbalah could be that it's handed down from father to son or whatever, disciple to student. But the idea here was with the Zohar, for example, we're jumping ahead to the Zohar, is that actually this was a text that was only handed down in secret. So in other words, yes, if you say that these were secret ideas which were handed down, never written down, then fine. But if you then put a flag in the sand and you say, no, actually this text was an ancient text and it was handed down in secret, or it was hid somewhere, now you have that artifact and some evidence, correct?
Now let's get back to the idea, because that is one of the claims made by traditionalists who, when seeing the mountain of evidence that the Zohar is in fact a late text, and we're going to get to that evidence in a moment, when confronted that, they'll say, but the ideas within Jewish mysticism, those are much older. Maybe the text was written late, the ideas are older. The truth is that even this is a very difficult claim to make, simply because many of the ideas within the Zoharic corpus and within other Jewish texts of the 12th, 13th century bear a very strong medieval imprint. Okay, so much so that it's very difficult to claim that these would have been written before the rise of Jewish philosophy. And this is actually one of the question of where does Kabbalah begin and why. So where we have a good idea, it seems to begin something like generally in Provence, which is in the Provençal area in the south of France. It moves across the Pyrenees into northern Spain, into areas such as Catalonia and Castile. And there the major texts are written. And it seems to be, at least one of the major theories that are proposed by scholars nowadays, is that this was all part of the Maimonidean controversy. Okay, so the Maimonidean controversy, which racked southern France and northern Spain during those particular periods, again those decades, was the reception of the Rambam's work. The Rambam, of course, Maimonides is the great 12th century Jewish philosopher, and he proposed a hyper-rationalist view of Judaism, a system which essentially recast many central Jewish ideas, the idea of God, prophecy, the revelation, prayer, all these things in a far more rationalist and far more philosophically literate and philosophically amenable mold, essentially, recast it entirely. And such ideas were very fruitful and very well accepted, for example, in Islamic Spain and elsewhere, where there was a very strong wind of philosophy, very strong ethos of attempting to synthesize Judaism with the very best of the culture and intellectual trends of the time, and was very much a part of the general rise in philosophically oriented religion within the Islamic world, etc. However, in northern Spain, which was dominated by the Christians, and within Christian Europe, the Rambam's works were furiously, or let's say there was a very strong controversy over it, so much so, famously, I think in 1232, the Rambam's works were burned publicly by Franciscan monks, usually said to be with the tacit approval of the Jewish authorities. In other words, the Rambam's works were seen as absolutely incendiary. And it seems to be that the evidence seems that the rabbis of the time, and especially those who were very literate within the Jewish canonical text, had to formulate some kind of alternative vision which rescued more traditionalist ways of understanding God, prophecy, prayer, revelation, all the things that I mentioned above. And that really seems to have been the beginning spark of Kabbalah. And one of the reasons we suppose is to be correct, I'm sorry, I'm going on here a little bit, is that Kabbalists, the early Kabbalah actually does seem to be wrestling with the same problems that Maimonides and Jewish philosophers and Jewish philosophy in general is wrestling with, right? So problems such as the simultaneous transcendence and immanence of God, right? How can God be completely different, completely obscure, completely beyond anything we can imagine or experience, on the one hand, and on the other hand, also be intimately involved in our lives, know everything that's going on with us, communicate with us, and also expect things of us, right? How can those two things be true at the same time, right? This is a huge problem at the heart of Jewish philosophy and of religious medieval philosophy in general, and the Kabbalists also take this problem very seriously. The problem of creation, right? How do you get from absolute unity to multiplicity? How does that happen? What are the mechanisms? What are the mechanics of this? That's another problem faced by the Kabbalists. And there are various problems like this. Revelation as well. How does the infinite communicate with the finite? How does God know things? What is the role of mitzvah? What is the role of commandments? All of these are questions very much at the heart of the...
And the Kabbalah was incredibly creative about it, and coming up with a system of how all that works. Whereas Maimonides is left his idea, if you read the guide, it's almost like a big question mark with no answer.
Okay, this takes us much too far afield, because it takes us into questions of how to read the guide what is Maimonides' worldview? What is his answer to these various questions, and are they contained in the guide? And are they contained?
But there's no mechanism.
An exoteric or an esoteric manner. These are all very true, but there's no heart of Maimonides' studies.
But there's no mechanism which is explained clearly about how this happens in Maimonides.
Again, this is firmly debated, and in fact, readers and listeners of the podcast will be glad to know that early this coming year, 2024, firstly, there will be a new translation of the Guide for the Perplexed by Len Goodman and what's his name? Philip Lieberman, perhaps? Anyway, and with a massive framework of explanatory notes, plus Len Goodman, who's a great professor of Jewish philosophy at Vanderbilt, is also releasing at the same time a book called, I think, The Guide to the Guide, or something like that, in which he attempts to explain in a whole coherent manner exactly what Maimonides' philosophy is based on the Guide for the Perplexed. But while this is a massive topic, I don't want to address it now precisely because it's too big, takes it too far afield. But you can say that you, Levi, are essentially taking the side of the Kabbalists in this, saying that
I've read it, and I've read the guide a number of times. It could be I haven't been able to discern it.
So just let me say, but I'm saying you shouldn't feel bad about taking this position, because both Kabbalists and non-Kabbalists have taken the position that Maimonides' system that he proposes is not, let's say, suitable or not loyal to the true concept at the heart of the biblical and rabbinic religion.
But that's not what I'm saying, though. I'm just saying that when you talk about the Kabbalists, you do a mitzvah, you're miyachid yichudim, right? You're basically creating this kind of the divine masculine with the feminine are now uniting in some kind of union where one impregnates the other, and flow of blessings comes down through that impregnation, etc. Those type of things which exist within the Kabbalists don't exist in Maimonides. That's all I'm saying.
Of course. No, on the contrary. This is, not just for Maimonides, for all Jewish philosophers, what you just described now, which is part of the system of the Sphirot, this notion that human beings could somehow affect a restitution, in other words, help clean up or help unify the divine realms, is rank heresy. the notion that humans can help God in some way was considered by the Maimonides not only as heresy, but also absurd, logically incoherent. In fact,
it's so interesting because you do have the Gemara, and I cite it in one of the other podcasts, that the Gemara, which talks about, okay, so who's in charge of God? And it says that Tzaddik is in charge of God. And then it's taken to this idea to mean, and it's cited all over Chassidut, that Tzaddik Geizer, Kadosh Baruch Hu Mekayim, that the Tzaddik can actually make a decree, and then God has to fulfill the decree. So theurgy is found in the Talmud.
Okay, seemingly the philosopher would respond, and this is the true answer to this, is that whether you take the Kabbalistic side or the philosophical side, both sides harness many sources within the biblical tradition, the rabbinic tradition, the Gemara, the Midrash, etc., and quote them all over the place. Both systems can be defended by, within the massive landscape of biblical and rabbinic ideas, texts, theologies, can be found to support both for a more rational philosophical side of interpretation of Judaism and for a non-rational mystical Kabbalistic side of Judaism, which is why representatives of those two schools are fighting till today, because neither have absolute proofs. You're right, you brought one Gemara and I could bring another Gemara and someone else bring another Gemara, another Midrash and another Midrash.
No, but I'm saying theurgy is not, you can say it's rank heresy, which is fine.
So I'm saying what the philosophers would say.
No, I understand. They could say that, but it's the Talmud is so broad. You have things which seem to indicate theurgy.
Levi, you're thinking much too rabbinically here. Okay?
No, which things seems.
What I mean by that is that both of these schools, both the philosophical school and the Kabbalistic school, make an art not only of adducing texts from the rabbinical position, but also by explaining away texts that don't work so well for them.
Yeah, exactly.
And of course, the philosopher would say, yes, you're right. You have this text that seems to allow for some kind of theurgy, seems to allow for some kind of human action and human effect upon the divine realms. However, no, it has to be understood in this way, and you have to understand it like that, and it can't possibly mean, look, what you've described is the least of the philosopher's problems, is the least of the issues. There are much, much bigger issues with the philosophical view of Judaism when reading a plain reading of the rabbinic and biblical texts.
Yeah, which is why it says, basically tells the Ram, how can you say God doesn't come in the body? In other words, there are people who thought that.
Correct.
You can say it's heresy. And that's the point we're trying to make. In other words, it's okay to say something's rank heresy. The only thing is that there are plenty of people within the tradition who thought that way. That doesn't mean it's not.
Okay. And I want to say a couple of things about what we just said, because it's very important. One is this difference between the philosopher and the historian, which is very important in how one approaches Judaism and how one approaches these discussions of intellectual inquiry in general. Okay. The philosopher says, or the philosophically minded individual, let's say, I'm thinking that wrong. I'd say ideologically minded individual says the following: there is a truth, one truth. This truth exists, and the Jewish tradition, the Jewish religion, has attempts to mimic this truth or attempts to represent this truth, live out this truth. However, there have been certain deviations from it. So let's say you're a Kabbalist and you say the truth is the Jewish mystical tradition in Kabbalah. True, there have been some anti-Kabbalistic thinkers. Okay, so unfortunately they've deviated, and that's not true Judaism, and that's a little unfortunate. But what can you do? There's one distinct line of truth, and it is coherent and it is unbroken, and there have been those who are ne'eman, who've been loyal to it, and that's it. However, there is the historian's view of Judaism, right? And this view was best exemplified by a man called Heinrich Gretz, a great 19th century historian who wrote a brilliant essay in 1846 called The Structures of Jewish History. I recommended reading for everyone. It's, I think, one of the most important and impactful statements of Jewish historiography or historiosophy ever written, really. And he has a line there which is, and I'm not going to quote it exactly because, firstly, I can't remember the German, but also because I'm going to butcher it slightly. But it's something along the lines as Judaism is the totality of its history. Okay, and what he means by that is there isn't a Judaism that is this kind of pure, pristine element that sort of descends from heaven, but rather Judaism is the sum total of all the great thinkers and expositors and scholars and teachers of Judaism, what they have said. So Judaism encompasses everything: rationalism and anti-rationalism, scientifically oriented, anti-scientifically oriented. Every kind and every form of Judaism, Jewish religion you can find, there is this parallel within, not parallel, there is this that is constitutive of what Judaism is.
Yep.
And that is, in a way, a much more expansive and much more, in a way, tolerant view. So, for example, when looking at this Kabbalistic, it's ironic because Gratz hated Kabbalah with every fiber of his being. We can get to talking about that because it's a fascinating chapter. But this is a different way of looking at it. So I'm saying, so if you take the ideologically oriented view and say, listen, we have to adjudicate between the Kabbalists and the non-Kabbalists and say which is true and which is accurate, which is faithful to the Jewish tradition, that's a very difficult thing because, as I said, both sides have been represented by brilliant scholars, have harnessed the great arsenal of rabbinic and biblical literature to their side, and to try and nitpick and say, no, this one got this proof wrong and this one written, that's much more difficult. Whereas to say, no, both are part of the history of the Jews attempting to figure out their theology and figure out how best to understand, how best to read their past.
Ironically, though, you have, so the Ravid comes in along and basically says lots of other people thought that God had a body.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Rambam says that's heresy.
Right.
And you mentioned that some people think theurgy is heresy. The point is that the whole idea of calling something heresy and not heresy, ironically, came from the Rambam, right? So in other words, like, if they wouldn't have called one heresy and the other not heresy, then we wouldn't. But the second you start saying, no, this is the correct way of believing it, that's when it.
Yeah, this is a point that's been energetically pressed in recent decades, especially by Mark Shapiro and others. That that essentially, and Kellner and others, that Maimonides invented heresy. This is, or invented the notion, or that dogma is a very distinctly medieval Jewish.
No, I don't want to. I don't necessarily want to get into that again because we've done that. Let's get back to the Zohar. But the only point that I just bring that up only because you say it's a sum total of all these things, but then one guy gets along and says, what you think is heresy. But that's where it becomes
before we move on, because you quoted a line from the Ravid in the Mishnah Torah, which says, in which he castigates Maimonides. Maimonides says that anyone who believes that God is a body is a heretic. And Ravid comes along and he says, no. He says, Rabim v'tovim mimenu. Now, there's a big difference.
He says Gdolim v'tovim mimenu, I think.
Sorry. Right. Gdolim v'tovim mimenu. Sorry, I misquoted. However, there's a big difference how you vowelate one of these words. Have you heard about this? This is actually this is a very important point. Anytime someone brings this up, you should get into this, because there's two ways of reading the word mimenu. There is mimenu and mimeno. In other words, is the dagesh in the middle of the vav or the top of the vav? And what is the difference? The difference is, if the Ravad is saying Rabim v'tovim mimenu, greater and more important, greater and more important people than us think this, mimenu, than us, than me and you, than me, the Ravid, you, Maimonides, then what he's saying is, I, the Ravid, I'm on your side, Rambam. I believe, actually, that anyone who has, the people who believe that God has a body are wrong and possibly heretics. But I must admit there are those in my tradition, namely the French European tradition, who have believed this, possibly Rashi, possibly Balei Tosfot. There's a lot there. And therefore I must pay obeisance to this. I must not say this is heresy. However, if it's mimeno, if Rav is saying to Rambam, greater people than him, then the Rambam have said this, the Ravid might actually be including himself. In other words, it's possible the Ravid is subtly alluding to the fact that he himself doesn't think that God is incorporeal, that God doesn't have a body. And the truth is that a plain text reading, certainly of rabbinic literature and of the biblical literature, sees God as having a body. And that is nowhere, in anywhere in the rabbinic tradition, is it comprehensively denied that God has a body. Okay, this is a medieval philosophical idea. Now, it might be right, and according to Rambam, it is right. And I want to get into Maimonides' heaven, so I'm certainly not going to say that God does have a body. However, this is an important discussion. But quickly, before we get to the Zohar, I found the quote that I was looking for by Edward Gibbon, who's a great Enlightenment historian. Okay, and this speaks a little bit to this philosopher-historian dichotomy that I mentioned earlier. And it's a wonderful quote from his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which I think is worthwhile. It goes as follows: the theologian may indulge the pleasing task of describing religion as she descended from heaven, arrayed in her native purity. A more melancholy duty is imposed on the historian. He must discover the inevitable mixture of error and corruption which she contracted in a long residence upon earth among a weak and degenerate race of beings. It's a wonderful quote. It's one of Gibbon's finest quotes, and it speaks to this. In other words, are we trying to rediscover the purity, the absolute perfect truth as descended from heaven, or are we discussing ways in which fallible human beings, brilliant human beings with very deep knowledge of the canonical text and a very deep, let's say, religious sensibility, tried to reconstruct retroactively what they believe to be the truth. This is a very big distinction.
The former might be a fool's errand.
Yes, that's exactly the point I'm saying. This is the point. Because the former is a fool's errand, it's very difficult trying to adjudicate who's right and who's wrong in these topics. You can only lay out the full spectrum of the debate.
Yeah.
And now, having avoided halfway through, I don't know how much time has elapsed, but you wanted to talk about the Zohar.
So basically, we have to summarize, if anyone's jumping in at this point, we've basically said that the rise of the Kabbalah is perhaps a reaction to the rationalism of Maimonides.
Let me pause a second. One of the major factors was possibly the rise, was almost certainly a reaction to Maimonides. There were some other factors as well,
right,
including development of religious mysticism within Christian world, including various other factors. And it's also worth mentioning at this point, sorry to ruin the summary, that there is a similar rise of Jewish mysticism at the same time in Ashkenaz, called Hasidei Ashkenaz.
Right.
And it's a different type of mysticism. It's much more ascetic. It's much more musar, much more ethically based, but it's a different kettle of fish. So we're talking about specifically Kabbalah. But it's important to note that this is a world of fruitfulness and creativity on the ideological front that's not limited to Kabbalah.
So you have Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, very pietistic, etc. And you can read those books,
etc.
Yeah, and fascinating kind of things, which some people today have taken on. By the way, there's a group in Jerusalem which actually have taken on a lot of his ideas.
My deep sympathies. I hope they enjoy whipping themselves and rolling around in the snow. That's not to be recommended. Anyway,
so now the Zohar emerges.
Yes,
and initially from this fellow in the 1200s, Moshe de Leon starts to give out these texts.
Yes,
and perhaps it was him. Perhaps there was a group of his scholars. There were a group of scholars who emerged from, or was it just him? What is your view on all this?
What we can say historically is that Moshe de Leon was part of a Castilian circle of mystics, and there was a chabura or chevraya of mystics in that area, in that town. Who we have writings of many of the other ones. And between about the year 1280 and 300, Moshe de Leon himself starts putting out some of these pamphlets, and these pamphlets would eventually constitute much of what's called the Guf HaZohar, the major sort of core of the Zohar. And that starts to spread over various parts of Spain. Some of it makes its way to Italy, some of it makes its way to Eretz Israel. And there is this awareness that this new Kabbalistic set of pamphlets, set of works, which would all have a specific style and all assume a basic ideological framework, there's this realization that something, so to speak, new is afoot. And these works, after several centuries of being collated and augmented, added to, and eventually put together, and eventually printed in the 1550s, I believe, in Italy, they become what is known as the Zohar. But yes, it starts with being published by this man called Moshe de Leon. However, the content of the Zohar is the discussions and movements and adventures and debates of a circle of mystics set in 2nd century Eretz Israel. So it's Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, it's his son Rabbi Lazar, and various others.
Now, what language did Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai actually speak in the 2nd century?
2nd century, they would have spoken. The lingua franca would have been Aramaic.
Right.
In terms of spoken. Intelligent people would have also known probably Greek and maybe Latin, depending on how exactly where they had spent time, exactly where they were educated, and they would have read and written in Hebrew. Obviously,
so the
rabbinic literature of the time is written in Hebrew.
So what's interesting is that you find the Mishnah was written, which is a 2nd century document. No one disputes that, correct?
Right. Yeah, early 3rd century. Yeah, much better.
Okay, that area, that era, that was written in Hebrew. And then the Talmud, which was later, 400-500, right?
Roughly, yeah.
Was written in Aramaic.
Yes. And it was written in Babylon. It was written hundreds of miles away.
It was written in Babylon, not in the land of Israel. But the question is why, even according to, what was the idea of writing? Let's assume for a moment that we're going according to the opinion of the scholars, which say that Moshe de Leon actually wrote it and his scholars wrote it. So the question is why would they decide to write it in Aramaic, do you think, rather than Hebrew, which would have made more sense if you wanted to say it was really a 2nd century text?
Okay, so we're jumping ahead one step. I want to go back for a second before answering this, which goes as follows, which is that, so this book comes out in the 13th century, and of course it is, as I say, the sayings and doings of Rabbi Shimon and his circle, And there is an accompanying tradition immediately, pretty much immediately, from Moshe de Leon and others, which is that this is in fact the work of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his circle. In other words, this is written in 2nd century, 2nd, 3rd century Eretz Yisrael. Now, of course, from the very beginning, this was doubted, and there were Kabbalists and others who doubted this, and we'll get to that in a moment.
Now, the story he told was that he found that he was given to it. There was a ship which came to Spain.
There are various stories of how he came across it and various apocryphal ways. But what we do know is he definitely claimed to have a manuscript, copied after copy from an ancient source, and that was the source of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai itself. And that narrative, that this book is written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his circle, has remained within Orthodoxy till this day, and I would say occupies the majority of observant Jews until today. That's what they're taught, that's what they assume. However, there was a tradition immediately from the late 13th century onwards that this wasn't the work of Yochai. This was in fact writing by Moshe de Leon and his circle, and we can discuss later on exactly the extent of this. And basically you have these two conflicting narratives or conflicting ideas of where the Zohar comes from. And you have to adjudicate historically from the evidence which one is true, which one is not true. Now, of course, the reason this is such a huge question, of course, is that within the Jewish tradition, it matters a lot who wrote it, right? In other words, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is one of the heroes of the Mishnah, one of the fulcrums, one of the center points of the entire rabbinic tradition. And if he wrote this work, or if this work is a faithful recording of what he said, then wow, this is something extraordinary. This is a book that lies at the very heart of the tradition of Jewish text. This is very high up on the canonical list. However, if it's a book merely written by 13th century Kabbalists, who, by the way, Moshe de Leon didn't write any other great work. He's not known as a great figure aside from this. So then if it's written by him, then one can feel free to agree or disagree with that which is within, right? It doesn't hold such a strong place in the canon. That's why the question of authorship of the Zohar is actually a very strong question. It is a historical question, but it has very strong religious implications, which is why it's battled over so vehemently till this day. So then you ask about the Aramaic thing, right? So then there are many, basically, the claim that I have made elsewhere on a different podcast called Judaism Demystified, but it's really just a presentation of the academic conclusions of the last 150 years. This was first really put down academically by a chap called Adolf Jelinek in the early 1850s, and then taken on by Heinrich Gretz a decade later, and expanded by Christian David Ginsburg, and then eventually Gershom Scholem and others. And there's a very large cottage industry of this. But basically, there's a huge preponderance of evidence that, in fact, this is a late 13th century text. This is written in the late 1200s, augmented over the following century or two, etc. Now, one of the reasons is the Aramaic thing. So the book is written in Aramaic, you've correctly stated, which would have been the lingua franca, in other words, the spoken language on the street within 2nd century Eretz Yisrael. And this is one of the points, in other words, that in Tanaitic literature, including the Mishnah, including the Midrashim, scholars write in Hebrew. That is the language of scholarship. Whereas on the street, you speak, as I say, Aramaic or maybe Greek. Whereas the opposite is the case in the 13th century. By the time you come to the late medieval period in Spain, so Aramaic has become the language of the scholars. There is a very high barrier to entry to reading and writing Aramaic. Only those who are really well versed in essentially the Talmud, that's the main source of Aramaic, only such people could read a text like the Zohar, and therefore it makes perfect sense if you want to write a text that is supposed to be kept among a small group, that is supposed to appeal to the elite and be incomprehensible to the masses. What you would do is write it in the language that was reserved only for the elite. In the 13th century, that's Aramaic. In the 2nd century, that's Hebrew. So that's one of the main points that is made in favor of a late rendering of the Zohar. Aside from this, there are various aspects to the Aramaic, right? I don't want to dwell very long on any of this, but there are a few points to be made. It's a very late form of Aramaic, right? And actually quite a garbled form of Aramaic. It also betrays linguistic influence of things that happen later on. So, for example, phrases that are imported into Hebrew from other languages, or also imported into Aramaic from other languages, phrases that are imported into Hebrew and then Aramaic from the Ibn Tibbon family, who've translated many philosophical works from the Arabic into Hebrew, and then their translation sort of make it into the Zohar. And of course, there are actual words and phrases in the Zohar occasionally dropped here and there in Romance languages, in medieval Spanish, essentially. Several words, for example, the word gardin, as in a guardian, as in a guard, is used several times. And the famous pun of Eshnoga, there's a synagogue as an Esnoga. These things are all quite famous and brought together. Anyone who wants there are various good sources to read on this. Gershom Shalom's book, Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism, has I think a fairly comprehensive case on this, and there are two chapters on the Zohar. One is called the theology of the Zohar, and the other one is called like the man in the book or something, or the book and its author. And in there, he lays out the multi-faceted, multi-headed case for why it is almost 100% certain that the Zohar is written in the late 12th century, which is interesting because actually Gershom Shalom himself, the great scholar of Kabbalah in the 20th century, he writes this in his autobiography, he starts his journey by trying to prove that it was written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, that is in fact
just wasn't able to.
Yes, and he says after 20 years of research, he said he was forced to admit that Gretz and the German historians of the previous century were correct, and this is in fact a much later, and this is obvious from the language and from various other elements of
there's
the
geographical issues as well. For example,
right.
The authors
the
couldn't
Zohar,
have had an intimate knowledge of the land of Israel.
Exactly. There are several points. One is, as you say, there are various mistakes in the Zohar, right? One of them is, as you say, the geographical errors of the land of Israel. This is clearly written by people who've never been to Israel, people who had a mental map of Israel, but not a map of on-the-ground knowledge of Israel. There are other mistakes as well. There are mistakes in halacha. In other words, that there are various attributions of statements. There are mistakes in genealogies of rabbis, which is very interesting. In other words, this is probably written by, those passages are probably written by people who had read the various Gemarot but misremembered them and said this one was the son-in-law of that one instead of the other way around, or basically misquoted various genealogies. Yeah, there are various errors in the Zohar. And I think most convincingly, the Zohar includes various anachronisms, right? It mentions various things which only took place many centuries after Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and shortly before the 13th century. So it mentions the Crusades in quite a bit of detail. It mentions Muhammad and the rise of Islam. It mentions specific local events that occurred in Spain or Italy, which again would have been known very well to those in the 13th century. It makes various messianic predictions, and those predictions only occur at the end of the 13th, early 14th century, right? It makes 9 messianic predictions, because none of them came true. And so this all seems like a book which is written by people who are living and very much concerned with the times in which they live, meaning the late 13th century, early 14th century. So that brings up the question, as you mentioned before, the word pseudepigraphy. To what extent did those who distribute the Zohar, to what extent did they think that others would believe this would be an ancient text? This is also an interesting question. In other words, was it written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in quotes, but everyone was really supposed to know that this is a later text? Or no, was this a genuine attempt at fooling someone into believing it's an ancient text?
Yeah.
And this is actually not an easy question to answer.
It's interesting to me. What I find very interesting, my day job, I run a funding portal, which is basically an entity which is heavily regulated registered with the SEC and a member of FINRA, and everything which we put out there is actually regulated, and the powers that be see it. And when I first started this, and I know I digress a little bit, but I'm just giving an example because I think it's instructive here. We put up a website, and my marketing guy went to town on it. And then FINRA, which is the regulator, saw the website, and they basically read the riot act to us and said, this is misleading.
Interesting. And
they said, you better take it down. I'm like, what's misleading? We're not misleading anything. And when you talk about marketing, you basically puff up what you're doing.
Of course.
This is the greatest ad.
All advertising is like that. As someone who's submitted a CV several times, it's an act of, let's say, very creative self-construction.
Yeah, you want people to think that this is the best thing since sliced bread so that they should actually buy into it. Yeah. When FINRA looks at it, they're like, no, this is potentially misleading language, and now you're trying to get somebody to buy a security, etc., or buy something for you which could be misleading, which that could end up being fraud. In other words, even today, we have a big difference between what is marketing fluff, and everyone understands it's marketing fluff. Everyone gets that. No one's going to say your marketing material said that this is the best phone plan in the world, therefore it's the best phone plan in the world. If you're buying a phone, everyone knows that's marketing. In other words, when I think about Moshe ben Yom Tov from Lyon saying that this was written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, was that really good marketing on his behalf and should be understood as such? And we shouldn't hold him up to the same standards as FINRA would hold us up to.
Okay, there's a general response and a specific response to this. The general response is that actually in the medieval and ancient world, pseudepigraphy was very common. It was
part of marketing, right?
It was part of marketing, but it was a very regular technique. So, for example, those who, even within the Kabbalistic tradition, the attribution of the Sefer Yetzirah, the Sefer Bahir to Avraham Avinu or Adam, or whoever it is.
Let me just make one more point. I've learned the Rosh and the Ramban, for example, and they were almost identical. The texts were almost identical. Anyone who's learned the Rishonim, you find Tosfos, and then the Rosh, and then the Ramban, and then the Ran. A lot of their Pirushim on the Gemara are almost identical to the other. And one said, were they copying from each other? In other words, obviously, there was some text they were all copying from in some kind of way, making slight changes. In other words, even those types of texts, today you would consider that to be fraud or stealing someone else's ideas. But back then, in the Middle Ages, this is the way people...
So with that specific example, I'm not sure I agree fully in the sense that I wouldn't say they were copying from each other. I'd say they were adhering very rigorously to a format that was acceptable among scholars, right?
But the language is almost identical to each other. Very often.
Meaning they will say a pirush that's, let's say the Rashba will say something that's identical to the Ramban, or the language they use is almost identical.
The language is often identical, word for word, verbatim.
Okay, no, fair enough. In that case, that can sometimes be... The truth is that within the rabbinic tradition, there are some who are very careful to attribute everything they say to someone who came before, and there are others who are not, and who feel free to basically repeat ideas without prior attribution. That's one thing. But the truth is that you mentioned this, well, within different circles, within different industries, so to speak, there are conventions, right? And you see this nowadays as well. The way you write a paper in literature, if it's to be accepted by a top journal, has to look a certain way and be formatted a certain way, and has to do a literature review, etc. And the same in history, the same in science, and there are very strict conventions. But in general, as I was saying, pseudepigraphy seems to have been something that already from the ancient periods down to the medieval period seems to have been a fairly reasonable and also a widely practiced.
Right, but it's not fair for us today to say that's sock puppeting, right? Today that would be considered sock puppeting and immoral. Right. But that's the same thing as saying that anyone who had slaves in the time of Abraham Lincoln was a terrible person, right? In other words...
Okay, I'm not sure the analogy is precise, but what I will say is that the discussion you're saying, because there are important differences, but
of course,
but I will say the following, which is that this is actually a big difference between, if you open up the chapter that I mentioned by Gershom Shalom before, which is in which he talks about concluding that Moshe de Leon was in fact the author of at least a very large part of the Zohar. So he talks about that is the opinion reached by Heinrich Gretz, the great German historian of the previous century. However, he writes there, he disagrees with Gretz because Gretz sees de Leon as a forger. He sees it as forgery. And this is the opinion of Gretz and of Moritz Steinschneider and various members of the Wissenschaftsjudentum movement in the 19th century, because these were very punctilious bibliographers. And for them, the greatest crime is pseudepigraphy, is to misattribute a text, because that throws the scholar off the trail. If you say someone wrote a book or wrote a text and he didn't, then that does violence to the scholarly attempt to find the truth. Or to construct a genealogy, an intellectual genealogy. Whereas Gershom Shalom said, no, this isn't forgery. This is pseudepigraphy. This is a fairly well attested to, but also not entirely non-admirable way of writing. In other words, he says that, no, this is a way of saying that these ideas were part of the school of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, part of the tradition of Rabbi Shimon, etc., etc. And this is, and I'll tell you something, this is even something which can be applied across the Jewish canon, even within the Bible. For example, I'll give you a basic example. There are many Pirkei Tehillim, there are many chapters in the book of Psalms which start with the phrase Le David.
Yeah.
And that's a very difficult phrase to translate. What does Le David mean? To David? Of David? For David? In honor of David? That's actually not, what are you saying there? And especially those who are amenable to some form of biblical criticisms and say that many of these Psalms are written later, etc., etc. So Le David there would translate something like in the Davidic tradition, or part of the Davidic library, part of the Davidic manner of writing Psalms. And if you say that, then what is that? Is that pseudepigraphy? Is it misattribution? The answer is yes and no. It's saying that this is a Davidic Psalm without saying it's written by David. It's like saying this is a Shakespearean poem. Not that it's written by Shakespeare, but it's written in the manner of Shakespeare.
But if you, the nice thing is, if you take away that charge of forgery, then in other words, it can still be an important text, and it was just good PR. And
the truth is, and here's the crux of the argument, which is that if Orthodox and observant Jews nowadays would say this is a text written in the 13th century in the style of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, or in the tradition, the mystical tradition of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, then that's actually a very non-offensive thing to the historian. You can say, oh yeah, sure, whatever, I agree to that. The problem is that's not the claim. The claim typically advanced by religious Jews is not that the Zohar is written inspired by or in the tradition of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, is that it is written by him or by his son or whoever, written by him and his immediate circle. And that's a different claim altogether, because as I described before, the ascription of earlier and historical periods of a certain text gives it much more canonical weight. That's the problem. Now so I said that's the general response. The specific response to what you said about pseudepigraphy is that we have a story. We have the evidence of a man called Yitzchak Demin Akko, Isaac of Akko, who, very briefly to repeat it for the audience who don't know it, it was a Kabbalist himself in the early 1300s, and he got hold of a piece of the Zohar from in Eretz Israel. He saw it, he liked it, he was curious about where it came from, so he traveled actually to Spain, and he met Moshe de Leon, but not when Moshe de Leon lived. And Moshe de Leon said, yes, this is a text written by Rabbi Shimon Yochai. I have the original manuscript. Come to my house, come visit me in a villa where I live, and I'll show it to you. Okay? And then what happens is, Isaac Yaakov says, okay, I'm going to do that. A few months pass. Isaac Yaakov goes to Moshe de Leon's house, and Moshe de Leon has died.
As fate would have it.
As fate would have it, he's dead. And Isaac Yaakov still wants to see this manuscript, so he offers Moshe de Leon's widow a very generous financial settlement. In other words, I'll basically set you up for life if you just give me this manuscript. And Moshe de Leon's wife, according to Yitzhak Yaakov, said, I'm sorry, but there is no manuscript. He made it up of his own accord. And in fact, when I asked him, why did you say this is by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai? He said, oh, for sales. He says that people wouldn't actually pay me, wouldn't bother buying this if they thought I wrote it. Then Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai wrote it. Okay, fine. So then that's very good for sale. Very cynical. Now the question becomes, this evidence, which was written in the early 1300s and is published in a book called Sefer Yuchasin in the early 1500s, this is seen as the linchpin by those who think that the anti Shimon Bar Yochai crowd, and those who believe that the Zohar is a piece of late scholarship. The question becomes, how good is this piece of history? And that's a bit of an open question, because maybe Moshe de Leon's wife was lying. Maybe she was lying to protect him. Now, it seems implausible. And in fact, Moshe de Leon's daughter ratified the words of his wife. And maybe Moshe de Leon, this is Arthur Green, I think, in his introduction to the Zohar, says that he thinks that Moshe de Leon was lying to his wife. In other words, he thinks that this is something you say to a wife when you want to get rid of her. Oh, I just made it up.
Yeah, I saw that.
Don't bother me. And when I first saw that, I was a little bit surprised. But I think, again, I don't agree, but there's something to that. In other words, this is the testimony of a woman. No, what her husband said, but did her husband mean it? And what was she being honest? This is actually, to me, not the strongest point against the Zohar at all. It is an intriguing piece of evidence, but much stronger are the historical anachronisms, the linguistic anachronisms, the various mistakes. And of course, most importantly, we didn't mention this is very important, is the 1,000 years of silence, okay? Because between Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in the 2nd century and Moshe de Leon publishing this work 1,100 years later, you have massive bodies of Jewish texts, none of which mention the Zohar. Not in the Talmud, and not among the Gaonim, and not among the Rishonim, and not among the Rambam, and not among the Halachists, and not among there is no mention that there is this mystical text by Shimon Bar Yochai. Not only is there no mention of it, but many prominent Gaonim, such as Sadia Gaon and Shmuel ben Chofan and others, and of course the Rambam, and of course other early Jewish philosophers, all construct a worldview that is profoundly hostile to the Zohar. Yep. So if they knew about it, they certainly didn't consider it canonical, and because they never mention it, never mention its ideas, never talk about it, so clearly they didn't know about it, they didn't have it. And if these titans of the Jewish intellectual tradition didn't know about it, didn't have it, didn't speak about it, and didn't consider it, if they did have it, didn't consider it important enough to place at the center of their worldview, then the 1,100 years of silence is really damning. It really seems to be that this was an invented tradition in the 12th, 13th century.
Yeah, and the argument that this was a reaction to Maimonides, someone as great as Maimonides, like that he didn't know this tradition, right, and actually went in a whole different direction, should be pause for thought enough.
But now you've hit upon, of course, a wonderful piece of Jewish conspiracy theory, which is there's a whole cottage industry from the 13th century till today of trying to reconcile Maimonides, the great rationalist, and the Zohar and Kabbalah. In other words, right, Maimonides was a secret Kabbalist.
It's interesting. They said the Chabad Rebbes, they said they learned the Mer Nevuchim al pi Chassidus, which is you're mixing your genres.
100% mixing genres, but they would say obviously not. But again, this is. But this speaks to the desperate position, we were discussing this earlier, the desperate position a little bit of those of the Hasidic tradition and of the later Kabbalistic tradition who had to square the circle. Yeah. Why is it that Kabbalah and the Zohar stands so much at odds with the rationalist tradition of Sadia Gaon, of Maimonides, of many others? How can you square the circle? And the answer is with an enormous amount of creativity and an enormous amount of free reading and ignoring certain things, you can actually square the circle. Whereas it seems to be very clear that the circle can't be squared. The best book in English on the subject is a book by my old teacher Menachem Kellner. It's called Maimonides' Confrontation with Mysticism. And this is a book which shows to my mind, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that important mystical ideas that were in the time of Maimonides, which Maimonides knew about, which he talked about, which he quoted, and subsequently fully and completely rejected, this is a very strong case that Maimonides knew about certain mystical ideas and absolutely pushed them away with two hands.
It's interesting, Hashgacha Pratis, and this is going from the tangent for a second now, is a really interesting example to me, because I was brought up with, hey, the Baal Shem Tov came with his concept of Hashgacha Pratis, and then I read in the Rambam basically laughs at it. He scoffs at the concept.
Hashgacha Pratis, meaning divine providence over the individual and over individual actions.
Over the details.
Rambam, the Ralbag, Ravad Harishon, Ibn Dawood, yes, there's a long tradition of essentially rejecting the notion that God exercises providence over each and every individual person.
The Rambam almost seems it to be a stupid idea. He says, you're telling me that God is making the young child sick and causing him pain?
It gets worse, because if you actually open up the Saadia Gaon's Sefer Emunot V'Deot, you will find that he has very harsh things to say about the concept of Gilgul Neshamot, of transmigration of souls, or metempsychosis, and basically says he once heard there's some non-Jews who believe in this foolish thing, and it's obviously not true for reason A, B, C, and D. And the problem is that this is at the very heart of Kabbalah. So this is why being intellectually honest is so important, right? Because you'll have some who bend over backwards in 100 different ways to try and reconcile the rationalist and the mystic Jewish tradition. But the truth is that we have to be, even if we are partisans of one tradition or another, it behooves the intellectually honest individual in the 21st century to look at these intellectual traditions and say, these are two genuinely opposing sides, both of whom were represented by great scholars, both of whom can rely on large parts of the biblical and rabbinic tradition, and therefore we have to know that there are conflicting strains of ideas within Judaism, and that's okay. It's okay that our intellectual history is expansive enough to admit that.
So, one of the things which really struck me out was the Rosh Hashanah Kippur. So I was opening up the Machzor. I've got the Art Scroll Machzor, and what jumps out is there's whole portions of the Zohar there, which you're reading. And I don't know whether you read them.
One of the most famous one, of course, is we read every time we take out the Sefer Torah is Bruch Shmei D'Marei Alma.
Bruch Shmei. That's true. But it's really made its way into the canon and into the liturgy. And what I find really interesting is then this book, now from the 1300s, which emerged then, has had a massively outsized influence on Judaism. And how would you characterize that? And what would a Judaism without Kabbalah, without the Zohar look like, do you think?
Okay. So I was afraid that you were going to add that last bit of the sentence. And I want to address that first. No, because I tell you why, because it touches on a very difficult question of historical methodology. Okay. So I'll get to all the other parts of the question. It's a very important question. But the last part of the question is actually something which should be tackled first, because it's by no means clear that this question can be answered for the following reason. There is a big debate among historians, among intellectual historians and philosophers until this very day, which is how important, how impactful are ideas upon history, okay? In other words, do events move people into adopting certain ideas, or do ideas move people into creating events, right? This is the subject of the introduction to Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy, which is an absolute classic and everyone should read it. And in the introduction, he deals with this and comes out with sort of middle position. But this is a strong question even till today. And in fact, there's a big argument, for instance, in the last 20, 30 years among scholars of the Enlightenment, right? So the 18th century during the 18th century, what was generally known as the European Enlightenment, this surge of writing and thinking, which prioritized scientific inquiry and philosophical inquiry and the rights of man and democracy and basically the rejection of the ancien regime of church and state, etc., etc. And towards the end of the 18th century, what you had was various revolutions, most importantly, the French Revolution within Europe, right? You had the complete overthrow of French society, of, again, the church, the state, the system of hierarchy within the society was completely overthrown in favor of something much more, at least ostensibly, initially democratic, egalitarian, etc., etc. The question, is there a connection between the two? Okay, there are some historians who will basically say, no, the French Revolution was caused by social factors, by economics, by the fact that the country had suffered defeats in battle, terrible famines, terrible harvests, people were starving, the government couldn't function anymore, and therefore they rioted in the streets, overthrew the government, and that was that, right? Whereas there are others, and this is the position of one of the great intellectual historians of our century, a guy called Jonathan Israel, who just came out with a 1,300-page biography of Spinoza, if you're interested. Yeah, I know, it's quite something. But one of the great intellectual historians, and basically he wrote a book ending the saying, no, actually, the ideas matter. There's an intellectual history here. And were it not for the fact that you had this tradition of radical Enlightenment ideas, you couldn't have had a revolution in favor of democracy, equality, liberty, etc. All of these things are a product of the ideas that came before it, right? Obviously not exclusively, but still. And so that's why I was a bit afraid you were going to ask me, what Judaism without the Zohar look like? Because you're assuming already that there is, and this is an assumption that many make, and I'm not proving the assumption, but I'm saying that it's an assumption nonetheless, that the ideas and the theology and the text, the heart of the Zohar, are prime movers within a history. And maybe you wish to defend that proposition, perhaps. But I want to draw your attention to the difficulty of that.
There are certain specific ideas I had in mind. Okay. For example, in the Zohar, you find, and this is an extreme example that I'm going to find, but you find that basically that masturbation and adultery, in other words, a man having intercourse with a married woman who's not his wife, they're equated as the same, that just the sins are equal. That's an example. There are other examples. For example, the elevation of the idea of washing your hands in the morning, for example, and not walking four cubits without that. And that is something so hypersensitivity to ideas of not just sexual purity, but also personal. And there are people today, you have this shuvavim, and you have people, I remember distinctly during shuvavim in Jerusalem, standing in Shtibelach then, seeing young men crying their eyes out, right? Because obviously they were repenting for something in a behavior which is normal, natural behavior of a teenager. And the point we're trying to make is, and that was all very influenced by the Zohar, right? And so in other words, there are this very puritanical version of a religion. And so you have a religion today where very orthodoxy today, which is very focused on that, not, for example, much focused on honesty in business. Whereas if you look at the prophets, for example, and you look at some of the halacha, there's a very great focus on honesty in business, not as much as, and at least as equal amounts. So I'm just giving examples of practical examples of things which the Zohar really stressed upon, which had practical influence on the way things are practiced.
So let's discuss a little bit historically the spread of the Zohar, because this comes very much into play in this, and we'll get to this toward the end of this process. It's important to understand why and how the Zohar, and just in general, let's say Kabbalah from Spain and from that particular area, spread out and more or less conquered the Jewish world. You're right. So this happened in the wake of 1492, and this is very clear. This is very easy to see. In the 15th century, if you compare the 15th century to the 16th century, there's no comparison. In other words, before 1492, Kabbalah seemed to still have been the preserve of a very small mystical elites, largely in these circles, I say, northern Spain and elsewhere, and not really spread all that far. Yes, a bit in Italy and a bit elsewhere, but certainly hadn't conquered the Jewish world in any meaningful way. What happened was, there was obviously the disaster of 1492, the expulsion of the entirety of Spanish Jewry, an estimated 250,000 Jews spread to all the corners of the world. Now, and so first, so you had, and basically the 16th century, the 1500s, immediately following, was that century in which Kabbalah rose and expanded and exploded. So there are various possible causative factors. One of them is obviously the people. In other words, simply the spreading of scholars and individuals and communities for whom the Kabbalah and the Zohar was a big deal within Spain, to various corners of Central and Eastern Europe, to Italy, to the Ottoman Empire, to Eretz Israel, to North Africa, to various other places. Simply the spreading of the people who had the Zohar in their suitcase was very important. The second one was technology, was printing. Okay, the Zohar was printed in the 1550s, and once you can print something, this must be stressed in the history of ideas in general. Printing was so crucial because two things. Firstly, it allowed for the creation of one coherent Zohar. In other words, pre-printing, you had lots of Zoharic manuscripts. They were often different. They often said quite different things, and they developed in different ways. Whereas in printing, you got to systematize and uniform. I don't know what the verb is for this. To make uniform all the various texts of the Zohar until you have the Zohar. In fact, there's one scholar, Daniel Abrams from Bar Ilan, who's argued that essentially the printing created the Zohar in this important way. The Zohar, capital Z, was was created in the era of printing. And of course, the dissemination. In other words, once you're printing, you can much more cheaply and much more efficiently and much more easily spread the same ideas to all corners of the world, which is why the Reformation and the Enlightenment and everything could happen, essentially, because you can create one standard version of something.
So now that it's here and it's having this influence, and there's scary things in there, right? In other words, it says things which are, even if you don't understand all the details of all the different things that it's referencing, there are certain things which make you sit up and say, wow.
Oh, definitely. But there's, yes, I want to emphasize one or two other things. One of them is that there's the decline of Jewish philosophy, which is actually a story in and of itself, and how that's related to the rise of Kabbalah. I actually don't want to talk about it at the moment. It's a bit too complicated. But there's the theory of Gershom Shalom. I keep on mentioning Shalom, and the truth is, when discussing Kabbalah, it's impossible not to mention him, because he was the great scholar of the 20th century, upon whom all the theories rise and fall. In other words, whether Shalom was right or not is essentially one of the major activities of modern day scholars on Kabbalah. But his theory was a psychologizing theory. In other words, he believed that the great cataclysm of the expulsion from Spain, the destruction of the greatest Jewish community in the world, the Spanish Jewish community, that was so disastrous that Jews required a new theology which would enable them to process this, enable them to ascribe this meaning, enable them to see seeds of hope within this, and that was provided by Kabbalah. In other words, it wasn't just the scattering of people, and it wasn't just the invention of printing, it was a mass psychological need to have a theology which could explain disaster, in fact had Shvira and Tikkun at the very center of it, and which would allow these exiles and those who saw all the travesty and all the travails and all the disasters to be able to rebuild their lives and to conceive it theologically in a way that was amenable to them. And that really, again, others have disputed this, and Edel has disputed this, and Libus and Hus and others have had also have written against this. But if this is true, and it may well be, this does explain.
Well, you have Sabbatianism and Frankism, which also...
We'll get there, because that's another very important part of Shalom's theory, which is, again, if he's right, it is absolutely crucial to the development of Judaism in general. And if he's not, then we can discuss further. But we'll get to the theory in a minute. But the point is that once you have the spreading of these ideas in these communities and these people and these texts through printing, through migration, and through the psychological needs, so that explains a little bit why you start to see in the 16th century the introduction of Zoharic texts. And of course, that leads into the rise of this massive, this incredibly bright but very brief flowering efflorescence of Kabbalah in Sfat in the 16th century. In other words, you had a gathering of people like Yosef Karo, of course, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, the Arizal, Moshe Cordovero, Shlomo Alkabetz, various other major figures within it. The whole story of Kabbalah in Sfat is a few decades long. It's really very short, but during that time it was very intense and an enormous amount of creativity. But as you mentioned before, so it starts to seep into theology, especially with the Arizal and others developing it greatly, and Moshe Cordovero systematizing it. But as you say, it starts to seep into various places, including Halacha. And one of the most interesting places you mentioned before, and the Shulchan Aruch really spearheaded this, written by Rabbi Yosef Karo. So for instance, if you open up Maimonides' Mishneh Torah, so when you wake up in the morning, the first thing you do is start blessing. Right? You open your eyes, you say the blessing of Pukach Ivrim, you put on your clothes, you say the blessing of Malbish Harumim, etc., etc. You immediately start the process of praying and blessing the second you open up your eyes, because when you wake up in the morning, you just wake up in the morning. That's it. By the time you get to the Shulchan Aruch in the 16th century, so then you have, again, this influence of the Zohar, which says that when you sleep, a ruach ra'ah, an evil spirit comes, or evil, exactly how you translate that's a complicated story, but it comes to rest on you during the night, and therefore you need to purge yourself of any evil nightly residue, which, as you say, I think is possibly connected to the possibilities of having accidents, so to speak, at night and of various sorts. And that is something you need to cleanse yourself before you open your mouth and pray. You cannot pray in your state of impurity. Whereas Maimonides and the Maimonidean tradition say, what do you mean impurity when you wake up in the morning? From what? What, do you touch a dead body during the night? No, you slept. Nothing happened. So yes, that's a very important part. Yeah.
I'm saying that's one example, but there are other many hypersensitivities which kind of move their way into the practice of Judaism, to the degree where you have today a practice of Judaism which is almost entirely segregated, right?
Now this is an important point,
etc. Which is that a Kabbalistic influence?
To a large degree, yes. There are those who argue yes,
and then you have
go
ahead. And then you have the hypersexualization of practice of Judaism, right? With these different sfirot and the unifications of the masculine and the feminine, which exist. Which also, that's a new idea. It's a really interesting dichotomy of a puritanical kind of practice of Judaism, where you have segregated here, but and then when you think about God, you think about the sexualization of the Godhead in many ways, which is
I don't wish to
really
burst your bubble on
interesting
that. I don't wish to burst your bubble on that. It seems to me that certainly for the
Yeah.
average Jew, and even for most Jewish scholars, that sexual reading of what you're doing when you're performing mitzvot, of allowing for the various sfirot to come together in a way that's
Yeah.
described in the Zohar as a very erotic and very sexual way, especially
Yeah.
the connection between Tiferet through Yesod and into Malchut, masculine and
Right.
feminine energies. And that's,
Which
again,
contain.
hyperly sexualized. I don't think all that is very present in Jewish ideas, Jewish thought. It certainly exists, and Kabbalists know about it and talk about it. That I don't think.
No, people who practice it don't think about it. But what I am
Or
saying
know
is,
about it generally. Or I mean, maybe some do, but the vast majority do. However, you are certainly right that the performance of mitzvot as affecting changes in the divine realm, which in turn, there's this double flow of energy or whatever you want to call it, which basically by doing good deeds and by rectifying the divine world, you open up channels of divine flow down into this world and increase blessings and increase goodness in the world. That's something that is very important because that gives a much more central place to the activities of human beings within the view of the world and of the cosmos. Because again, on the Maimonidean view, what are you doing when you're doing a mitzvah? You are perfecting your body, you are perfecting your society, and you're perfecting your mind. Those are the things you're doing, which is fine. And that's a noble thing in Maimonides' mind. That's worthwhile spending your entire life pursuing.
Yeah.
Having said that is a little bit small compared to the Kabbalistic vision, which is by putting, in other words, let's say I'm shaking your lulav. We're recording this just before Sukkot, so a few days before shaking your lulav. So in the Maimonidean view, why are you shaking your lulav? It reminds you of something, or it helps with the perfection of the mind, or it helps you discipline yourself and obey divine laws, and therefore you can, all these things. Whereas, okay, that's one thing. Whereas if you say to yourself, no, by energetically waving these pieces of vegetation in the synagogue, I'm in fact essentially fixing the universe. I am putting together, I'm putting back that which is broken in the divine realm and consequently in the human realm, then there's a cosmic dimension to everything. And that's huge. That's extremely valuable, also extremely inspiring and motivating for your average Joe who otherwise wouldn't possibly know about this. So that's one aspect. There's another important aspect which you touched on a little bit, but I think that the spread of, again, whenever I say the words I think, almost nothing I say here is new, in the sense that this is my conclusion, having read various primary and secondary texts on the matter, much of whom say what I say, and I'm not claiming any originality here, which is the rise of an essentialist view of certain things, right? In other words, the Zohar and the Jewish mystical traditions in general have a very essentialized view of the various dichotomies that are present in the Sfirot, in the Godhead, or in the 10-part and 10-stage emanation of the Sfirot. So, for example, men versus women, right? Within there, women come from a very specific side, men come from a very specific side, and each of them, one is on the right, and one is on the left, and one is higher, and one is lower, and one has this role, and one has that role. A very strong essentialization of the roles of men and women, what men can do and women can't do. And this comes to the fore in many other respects, especially with sexual practices, certain things you can do, certain things you can't do, precisely because of these Kabbalistic aspects. And I think more importantly, the difference between Jews and non-Jews. In the development of Hasidus, and especially Chabad Hasidus, there is a very sharp wedge drawn between a Jew and a non-Jew. They are from different parts of the Sfirot. They occupy, they stem from different areas, different elements of creation. They are as far apart from each other as can possibly be. And there is an essential difference. And therefore, all sorts of interactions are to be avoided, and many other practices and laws that stem from this essentialized a difference between the two. Whereas from the Maimonidean philosophical perspective, the difference between Jew and a non-Jew is purely intellectual. It's what they believe, right? A Jew believes a certain set of things, and a non-Jew doesn't. And so fine, to become a Jew is actually, to become a Jew in the Maimonidean perspective is actually not a very difficult thing. You simply have to sign up to various beliefs and undergo a couple of procedures, and that's it. Whereas under the Kabbalistic view, to become a Jew is a metaphysical transformation of almost of
well, you had to have
the
source of your soul had to somehow be prior.
That's a very Hasidic development, because they're struggling with this point. Right. How is conversion possible if Jews and non-Jews are completely separate? And the answer developed in later centuries is that no, the soul of a convert must have been already must have in their root been a Jewish, from the Jews. Again, it's unfalsifiable. I can't prove it wrong, but this is a development from these Kabbalistic ideas that again flowed into the mainstream and through Hasidut.
You're not willing to answer what would Judaism look like without the Zohar. In other words, I know it's a counterfactual. I get it, it's right? But it's really an important question, because if, for example, We got it wrong. Moshe de Leon, as we now know, basically, he wrote, and his group of scholars wrote this book, right?
Yes, a group
so
of
it
scholars,
doesn't have the kind of import which it would have had whether if it was really a part of the canon and was written in the 12th century as part of what came from almost biblical times through to the 12th century. So now this is a later book, which should have been one of the books written by a later Rishon, basically, early Acher, right?
And treated as a nice midrash on the Torah with a few cute ideas, basically.
Exactly. And now it's had this outsized influence on all these, in these really important ways. And I've mentioned, because in the psyche, these things are really important. Some of the things I mentioned, not for the shock aspect, but because I think they're really important in how we think about things and how we actually judge how important, for example, it is to be honest in business versus, for example, the puritanical version of things. I think these in the mind of the way Judaism is practiced today, there are plenty of people who are quite happy, for example, potentially doing something which may be unethical in some realm of their life, but in the puritanical realm are very pure. And that is, I think, a Kabbalistic influence in many ways. The question is, so now Shalom's told us, and now we've realized this isn't such an important book. How do we
to
disentangle? How do we disentangle it? And is it possible to disentangle it? What would Judaism look like if we disentangled it?
Okay, so I'm going to answer this question with a bit of or I'm going to present a possible response. The truth is, the simple answer is impossible to know, obviously. Yeah. It's too big a counterfactual. However, I want to bring in one of Shalom's central theories, and again, say if he's right, it goes this way, and if he's wrong, it goes that way. Because that's really how you have to deal with Shalom. Now, just basically to introduce a little bit Shalom, the reason Shalom is such an important, impactful scholar, and to my mind, one of the greatest minds of 20th century Jewry, and was actually treated in his time as one of the great theorists and thinkers of religion at all in the entire world. He was very well respected. He went to these conferences in Europe, the Eranas conference, where he was sitting next to people like Mircea Eliade and Carl Jung and others who were great theorists of religion, and he was considered foremost among the company. Shalom was, again, very briefly, German-born, made Aliyah, a great Zionist, the founder of Kabbalah as a discipline within the humanities within the university itself, and founded what is today probably the most creative and productive discipline within the area of Jewish studies. And he had two sides to him. This is what's so interesting. Gershom Shalom was, on the one hand, one of the great punctilious scholars of the Jewish intellectual tradition. What do I mean? He produced dozens of books and hundreds of articles which paid such close attention to the minutiae. He delved into libraries and brought out manuscripts and paid attention to every word and every letter, mapped out the history so thoroughly and so carefully. He was one of these unbelievably detail-oriented historians, to the likes of which Judaism has rarely seen in the history of the religion, right? Really one of the greatest ever to play that game. And at the same time, he was also one of the great theorists of religion and Judaism as a whole, okay? And that's the fascinating thing with Shalom. He was both this incredibly punctilious scholar and also this grand theorist, this myth maker, this person who described very broad trends, very large trends. And that's what makes him so interesting, because there's often a bit of a gap between the two. In other words, and this is what his later Talmid Moshe Idel and Yehuda Libes and others have claimed, that there's basically essentially the gap between Shalom, the very close detail-oriented scholar, and Shalom, the grand overarching theorist that we have. And this is an important thing to decide. But I want to present one of his great overarching theories of Judaism and of Kabbalah specifically, and that will, and upon this theory, whether it's true or not, will depend the answer to this question that you stated. And the following is the case. The Shalom presented, I'm going to go even slightly further back, which is that he had, again, I'm sorry to do this lengthily, but it has to be hammered out slightly, which is firstly that Shalom had a three-part theory of the development of religion. Okay, development of religion, said, according to him, and again, this is very similar to many other Germanic thinkers of his time, had an initial stage of what he would call something like the unmediated, mythological, immediate stage, where primordial human beings of many millennia past had this kind of immediacy and unmediated, instinctual, reflexive relationship with whatever gods, whatever power, whichever animistic or metaphysical power they perceived in the world. That's stage one, this kind of instant, reflexive way of worship, spontaneous, if you like. And then comes the formalization of religion. Formalization of religion is creating rules, creating hierarchies, building temples, instituting a priesthood, making laws, all of that, instituting the paraphernalia of religion as we recognize it today. That's stage 2. And then he sees a third stage, which he calls the mystical or the mythical stage, which is essentially an attempt to rediscover stage 1. It is a rebellion against the formalism, a rebellion against the laws, a rebellion against the hierarchies of religion, which is an attempt to rediscover this, a futile in a way, attempt to rediscover this intimacy through rituals, through symbols, through techniques, through various ways of trying to get past the dross, or what they see as the dross of formal religion, back to the pre-formal state of religion. That is, for Shalom, mysticism. It is mysticism in general within the development of religion. And of course, these 3 stages occur in a cycle all the time. It's not as if there are 3, but they sort of occur all the time. For him, mysticism, specifically Jewish mysticism, is a counter-history. It is an energy, a force that existed within the religion from the beginning till today, which is spontaneous, it is mythological, it is rebellious, and it is antinomian, very importantly. It is against, it rejects the strict, rigid hierarchy and formalism of all the rules, of all the laws, and it represents a kind of vitality and a primal rejuvenating and regenerating energy, potentiality at the heart of religion and the heart of the Jewish religion specifically, right? And according to Shalom, these 2 elements existed simultaneously. You had the rabbinic kind of Judaism, which was very formal, very rigorous, very hierarchical, law-based, very much based on norms. And then you always had bubbling underneath this much more mythological, in other words, describing God much more in a person with personifications and in a much more earthy kind of way, antinomian, spontaneous, rebellious, vital stream within Judaism, which sort of bubbled along underneath and occasionally popped to the surface, and you see the effects of it in Kabbalah and Shabtai Tzvi, etc. So according to Shalom, you can draw a direct line between Kabbalah, the Zohar, and then it spreads within Spain to Shabtai Tzvi. He believes Shabtai Tzvi is a sort of inevitable consequence of this kind of antinomianism. And then to Chassidut, because for him, Chassidut is similar to Shabtai Tzvi, but defanged because it got rid of the messianic element. For Shalom, one of the great achievements of Chassidut is that actually withdrew the sting of messianism from within this antinomian picture of Judaism. And then into Zionism and Reform Judaism as well. In other words, for him, Zionism is also, especially early Zionism, this kind of rejuvenation of Judaism that rejects the stuffy formalism of the rabbis in favor of a return to a primordial state where it was much more the Jew and his land and the Bible and et cetera, et cetera. Now, the question is, if Shalom is correct that there is this kind of this tension, this antinomian vital stream within Judaism, mythological stream within Judaism, then it doesn't matter, then according to him, it didn't really matter Zohar or no Zohar. You would have always had this, let's say, anti-rabbinical, anti-formalistic strain, which would have been pushing against the formalism and would have eventually ruptured in various different ways. And Zohar or no Zohar, it doesn't really matter. Okay?
Would have been a different book.
Sorry, a different book, a different person, a different stream of ideas. There would have been a creative mythological form of theology, which would have included praxis, included theology, included all the accoutrements of Kabbalah, which would have come to vie against formalism and rabbinic Judaism, and would have manifested in different ways. So in other words, for him, the Zohar is an effect rather than a cause. Okay, in other words, it becomes part of the cause once it's written. It's a very important cause, but nonetheless, it is merely froth on the surface of much more powerful currents underneath. Now, of course, this view is, of course, profoundly hostile to traditional Judaism, because traditional Jews, especially those who like Kabbalah, will say that, on the contrary, Kabbalah is part of the rabbinic effort.
And my question was really from the perspective of a traditional Jew. In other words, it's not a question for the academic, because it's for the person who it's all of a sudden revealed that this is actually maybe not such an important book. That's when it becomes important.
Okay, so the truth is as follows: is that one can construct the argument. I think this is fair to say. Is that one can still salvage a Judaism even after the Zohar. What I mean by that is that the influx of the Zohar into halacha is relatively small. It exists. It's there. As you say, it makes its way a bit into the Shulchan Aruch. other later poskim. There's a very interesting chapter in the thesis in the book by Maoz Kahana and his dissertation on the Chasam Sofer and his view of the Zohar, because he occasionally adopts it as a halachic factor, but often rejects it. And Ravad Yosef rejected it. And many halachic decisors either reject or subtly play down, very much reduce the force of the Zohar. And also, the Zohar has made inroads into Jewish thought, but actually very large parts of Jewish philosophy, Jewish thought still is very Maimonidean, or very much a result of Yehuda Halevi and the Kuzari and that tradition, and not necessarily mystical. And the whole Hirschian sort of neo-Orthodoxian view, all of that is not really so influenced by the Zohar. And therefore, you can say, even after the Zohar, yes, there's some people who like the Zohar and it made inroads into halakha and a little bit of inroads into Jewish philosophy, but actually, you can still able to craft a Judaism that has been not too badly mangled, let's say, or not too badly disfigured by the Zohar. And I think that's possible to argue today. And I think it's true,
especially for the Litvaks. In other words, if you're a chassid, it's much more difficult.
Impossible if you're a chassid.
So I should,
which is of course why you shouldn't be one. That's reason 248. What do you want?
This was that the question was really like from that very, and the Haredization of Judaism, which is actually, I think, was really from that perspective. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Probably Judaism, without the influence of the Zohar, probably looks much more Hirschian and more modern Orthodox.
Again, if you don't follow Shalom's view. In other words, if you think that the Zohar was itself, and the Kabbalah itself, a major cause, rather than the result of something of much deeper tensions, then yes, you're right. You could create a historical counterfactual in which that is the case. However, I would say that while one might not swallow Shalom's ideas entirely, it seems very plausible that if the Zohar and that specific strain of Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, didn't come about, then maybe some other kind of mystical or ascetic, maybe Hasidut Ashkenaz-esque style of mysticism would have become dominant, given the historical events, given the realia, given everything that happened during the time.
You have the Essenes, for example. If you look back at the Dead Sea Scroll sect, for example,
the
which
Essenes,
also, so these things existed, and so anyway, this has been really great. Really
Excellent.
Grateful for you spending some time with me today.
It's been a lot of fun. I always enjoy conversations with you.
Yeah, same here. So I'm really grateful, and we've gone over time, but
as all good conversations do.
But I know that I've learned a huge amount, and I'm sure the audience will also learn a huge amount from this. I think we didn't just do the authorship of the Zohar, but we went across a very broad spectrum of Kabbalah, all the way from the beginning, all the way to Hasidism and beyond. So I'm sure this is going to be of very great interest for people who are looking for a wide perspective on the entire thing. So I'm really grateful for your time.
Thank you. Grateful for yours. Looking forward to next time.